ratings are getting restless. They might storm the stage any minute. Come on, I'd like to welcome John Robb to the stage, ladies and gentlemen. I feel as though we should be doing a gig, really. I'm a bit confused.
Yeah, well, we kind of known each other for about 40 years, but not that well.
Hold on a minute. Who's asking the questions?
I'm just thinking a little intro thing, because back in the fanzine days...
That's my first question.
Oh, is it? All right, we'll start there.
Stop reading.
Then, yeah.
Okay, we're going to do a bit of background. I don't know how much you know about John, but it goes back a long way. Originally from Fleetwood, Blackpool area. My first question was, what was it like there when punk was first emerging?
Probably the same as it was here. I think the way punk impacted on small towns, it's like a slightly delayed reaction. In fact, it's one of the themes in the book, I think, when I was writing about the goth thing, and to an extension post-punk as well. I think there's a generation of 15, 16, 17-year-old kids who were completely obsessed with punk, started making their own bands and getting it completely wrong. You know, and by getting it wrong, they got it completely right. You know, so a lot of the bands I wrote about in my book, you know, the ones that came slightly after the punk thing, were people misinterpreting punk, but in their own ways. You know, and so that's what we were. You know, we were completely naive, didn't have a clue what we were doing, totally believed the punk thing. We actually thought it was a revolution. You know, we were 16, of course.
Yeah, but that was what made it interesting. Was the fact you were just doing it as opposed to learning how to do it. You just did it.
No, we weren't interested in learning how to do it. We were just doing it our own way. Yeah, it was basically just getting instruments and hitting them to make some kind of sense. It's not like you could get a YouTube video of how to write songs, or we didn't even know there was books, sheet music, stuff like that. But we wouldn't be able to understand that, you know. In fact, to this day, it's probably the same.
But that probably helps because nobody's kind of formulated anything for you. You're making it up as you go along, or you're getting better as you go along.
I think a lot of the best music is made like that. You know, a lot of my favourite bands are bands that don't follow the sort of the route that's already there. You're working all out yourself as you go along. And I think if you come up with something good through that process, that's the filtering process, isn't it?
Okay, you ended up producing the fanzine, Blackpool Rocks, and being in the band The Membranes. This is kind of where I come in, because this is where I contacted John via his fanzine. I was in a band called Religious Overdose. And basically I've gone through the thing that you just talked about, which is we started a band called the Eyesores. Never played an instrument, any of us, and we just did it. And we kind of learned as it went on. But that whole punk thing changed very quickly to something else. So tell us about that period where the punk thing happened, and then afterwards you got into something else. Well, when the Membranes started, for example.
Well, we started about 1978, so I think we thought we were a punk band, but we had no idea how to make those noises, so we just made our own version of it, like I say, then like you were doing. And we bands like, you know, our band, your band, other bands, we would trade cassettes. People would post each other cassettes, wouldn't they? And write letters as well, like really long
letters.
That's
what I really miss, is the fact I used to get fanzines and tapes and records and whatever in the post. There was always something to look forward to, apart from bills from the council or something. There was always something to look forward to.
Well, in a way, that's the same thing, but fast forward now, because you just do it with email and socials, don't you?
Yeah, but if you don't read an email straight away, you forget about it.
Well, they're not written in crayons and things like they used to be.
Okay, so you did Blackpool Rocks how many years?
Oh, about 8 years.
8 years. So it's quite a long time for a fanzine to last.
Well, we thought if we stuck it out, we could actually end up with a national. We did it. It was nationally distributed, but it was very DIY. It was nationally distributed in plastic bags, going around gigs up and down the country.
But I think that's when your first release came out. It was a flexi.
Yeah, well, it was one before that, but it was 1980 the first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've done all that. So how do you transition from being that to being a journalist and a TV pundit and then an author?
Well, it's the same process, I think. We did a fanzine, we're writing about music, and then we got to Zigzag, and I wrote about music in Zigzag. And Zigzag was the main.
Yeah, I remember.
It was actually the
Mick
goth
Mercy,
magazine. Yeah, when Mick was doing it, and also Chris Needs, it was the main kind of goth magazine, because a lot of those bands would not get into the music press, like local bands like Bauhaus always got terrible press, didn't they? But Zigzag,
Enemy and things. Yeah.
Zigzag always liked those bands. I mean, Mick was always slightly sarcastic in a really funny kind of way. And he did a magazine called Panache before that, and that was a really great fanzine. Because he was like almost like a comic. He's really well laid out and funny. And a lot of little sort of Spike Milligan sort of quote bubbles and all these sort of little things he snipped out and stuck together as collages.
Yeah,
I mean, there was a great fanzine culture then, wasn't it? It was like vague fanzine. Does anybody remember Vague?
Yeah.
It was like fantastic.
Vaguely, yeah.
Well, Tom Vague used to do articles that were like 3,000 words long, which I don't think anybody could write long articles then. Everything was in paragraphs.
Yeah.
But he would go on the road with Adam Jans in the early days, or Exmar Deutschland, and all those bands, and write these tour diaries around them. And it was proper writing. It was like Hemingway or something. Like the rest of us were just like, 3 sentences
Yeah,
got forward.
fanzines allowed you to do that.
Yeah, well,
Your
I
own
mean, they were
style.
great because they were an art form of their own like that, weren't they? But with him, I think Vague to me is probably the central magazine in that kind of period. What was not called goth actually, it was alternative music, wasn't it, at the time, and that was a term that came afterwards, wasn't it?
You seem to have gone on a parallel route with somebody we know in Northampton called Andrew Collins, who originally came from Northampton.
I know Andrew.
Yeah. Again, he worked with the Enemy first, doing reviews, and then became an author and TV pundit. So, do you have any parallels with Andrew?
I think he was much more part of the London media scene. I mean, I know those people, but I'm not really. I'm more DIY. I seem to be stuck in punk rock DIY world forever. But I like doing things my own way, and I think sometimes it doesn't. I've never had a career really, so I just do things on my own. Really, I don't go to the right pubs in London or hang around in IPC towers. I mean, Andrew's good, and he's a very good writer and he works very well in that world. But it's a world that I sort of dip in and out of all the time. I have no idea why I'm on the telly. They just asked me to just go and do it.
Yeah.
It's not like I sit there as a career with an agent trying to get on the telly.
Okay, you've done quite a few books, mostly centred around, this is kind of the crux, is centred around northern music, mostly things like North Will Rise Again, Death to Trad Rock, The Noise Bar, amongst many others. Is there a distinct north-south style?
Yeah, I think there is very much. I think both are good in different ways. In fact, that plays out in the book as well, The Art of Darkness. The goth thing is, which is very much a club culture based in clubs. I mean, Northampton would have had a goth club. It's probably in my book, in the list of goth clubs or whatever. And they weren't, and again, I have to underline, they weren't called goth clubs. They're alternative nights, weren't they? And the Batcave in London is the most famous, but the Phono in Leeds was the first, and that sort of underlines a north-south discrepancy, because the London scene, more in the 80s, was always under the media spotlight, and the north, to its advantage, I think, in a lot of ways, could actually fester on its own. Bands got 2 or 3 years with nobody reviewing the gigs, to sort of bumble and fumble their way into their own sound and their own culture. And in the book, I've kind of done sort of key bands, like I can't remember the number now, 14, 15 key bands, also written about the cities they come from, because the reaction to punk in each of those cities was completely different. Like Liverpool kind of veered towards like a West Coast psychedelia Doors thing. Manchester was kind of get to the future with Joy Division, that kind of very stark minimalistic sound. Sheffield was more electronic music, Early Human League, I mean, not a goth band, but influential on the scene. But Leeds, and at that time, rock music was like really sniffed at. People, that great quote from Pete Wiley, "The race against rockism," which is a fantastic quote. So you weren't allowed to like rock music, but Leeds being Leeds and Yorkshire being Yorkshire decided to embrace rock music and celebrate it, to go in the opposite direction, but in a very ironic way, which is Sister Mercy, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
which is very clever. They're on that tightrope between almost a parody of a rock band, but a complete celebration of a rock band, but also making this completely groundbreaking music with a drum machine which had hardly been heard in rock music before. Sly and the Family Stone used one in the late 60s. Suicide, of course, in the 76, 77, making, you know, that amazing first album, which is so influential. To this day, sounds utterly terrifying. But Sisters kind of used it in another way, didn't they? It was a very simplistic, sort of almost leaden beat, but it's very, very hypnotic. But because he DJ'd at the phono with his girlfriend Claire Shearsby, who is a very key figure in this story, because she was playing all the rock records, getting into rock music in the first place. But because he was DJing sometimes when she couldn't be bothered, you know, she's got something else to do, he'd watch the dance floor and he learned about the dance floor and wrote one of the greatest Sisters of Mercy songs, my favourite Sisters song for show, about the dance floor as well. That's the lyrics, classic, brilliant sort of Andrew Eldritch lyrics, you know, very minimalistic, but also very nuanced and very clever about people dancing. I mean, they're great words, you know, they're worth looking up on Google. You can look it up now, I won't manage it from your phones.
Okay, now let's talk about the book. The Art of Darkness, History of Goth. What possessed you to do that book?
I suppose you do need to be possessed in the context of it.
It's, yeah.
Well, about 10, 11 years ago, I mean, there have been goth books before. There's academic goth books, and there's Nick Mercer's book, which is fantastic. It's like an encyclopedia of goth, like an edited of goth, and everything's in there. And there's great photo books of goth, but I think what it needed was a pop cultural.
Well, this is what I was going to say. Nick Mercer's done quite a few books, especially the Hex Files, and it spawned quite a few releases on the music side, compilations.
But I wanted to do something different.
That's what I was saying. You took a different approach.
It had to be a deep dive, and I wanted to do like a pop culture book, you know. So even if you weren't totally into that scene, but you liked some of the bands, you get the context. I wanted to unpack it all and say what it was, and I also wanted to do a bit like what England's Dreaming did with punk. So before England's Dreaming, John Savage's great book about punk. I mean, punk was, I mean, obviously we all took it seriously, but everyone else kind of had this really cartoon idea of it, of people, oh, they just spit at each other and it's really stupid. No, it's not actually, it's an art form, you know, there's a lot of art school artfulness to punk, and there was still...
situationism and things like that.
Well, even if people didn't know that what that was, you know, people accidentally artful. You didn't need to go to art school to be arty, you know. And punk was a great art form. But
well, everybody could do a Jamie Reid, you know, cutting up bits of paper.
He does do it very, very well.
I mean, it spawned a lot of people just to actually...
Yeah, well, which is brilliant, isn't it? Because if a 15-year-old kid is inspired to do something they didn't think they could do before, it's part of the empowerment culture, and punk was really empowering. So I wanted to do the same thing what was so-called goth culture, because it wasn't called goth originally. So by pointing out how these bands were some of the greatest art rock bands that this country's ever produced, you know. Because what I found my experience of being a journalist and music writer, most journalists, about 90% of music journalists, would look on this scene as just being a bit stupid, and they have this really cliched idea of, oh, people just white faces and black hair, which is great because it's great style, but it wasn't the whole thing, it wasn't the whole story. So I did the total unpack, so start with the Fall of Rome, and I ended with Instagram. So it wasn't just the bands, it was like the whole thing.
Okay, well, this is where we're heading somewhere else. We've taken in a lot of literature, of course, things like Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley and the Romantic poets. I think Byron could definitely be a rock star now.
Oh yeah, I mean, anybody who's described as mad, bad and dangerous to know, like Lord Byron, it's the greatest thing ever said about any rock star, isn't it? I think every rock star should be mad, bad and dangerous to know, shouldn't they?
I think they're kind of quite important for the lyrical subject of some goth bands, those writers.
Yeah, well, not just how they wrote about it, but what they wrote about. So the recurrent themes of sex and death, the big themes in life, ironically, which is death, they would write about, and also because they're influenced by drugs, because they were doing laudanum, so they were like going towards the boundaries or past the boundaries, pushing the doors to perception, all really important, and that's what makes it really fascinating. And I guess in a pop cultural way, it all coalesces around the Doors. And the Doors were the first band to be called a Gothic band. They're described as Gothic band in a 1967 review in New York, when they played their first and second gig in New York. And the other line, which is really great in that review, the same review, is that the guy wrote that the Doors reflects America's fascination with violence back at itself. That's a great line as well, almost as good as Mad, Bad and Dangerous to Know. And Jim Morrison is the Gothic archetype, isn't he?
And strangely enough, I talk about the Doors. Yeah, you're drawing a lot of different aspects from this maelstrom, from the Doors, alongside the cult, which obviously the Doors were, especially Jim Morrison got involved with the cult, the occult. But the book starts with the Visigoths sacking of Rome in the 4th century AD. So you're not limiting yourself. You've created a lot of work for yourself. How did you try and tie all this together?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm obviously not saying that the... In fact, I did think about this the other day, that the Visigoths sacking Rome, once they got into Rome, and they're running down the street, so they kind of shouting at people, we're not Goths, you know. You know, we're alternative.
Yes, you are.
But it's probably the first time I could find any mention of the word Goth. Maybe they didn't call themselves Goths. You know, maybe that's just like years later. You know, maybe they had a different name for their tribe. But it's the first historical idea, and also it frames the book quite nicely, because this idea of this kind of dark and scary tribe coming to trash your super civilized city. It plays into the narrative of what Goth became later on, which is the architecture, the German architecture, the Gothic cathedrals, which were looked down upon, but actually became their own art form, which influences the painting, the poetry, the books, which becomes like the Romantic poets. It does make sense. It wasn't like stuck at the beginning of the book as an outlier. It sort of all joins together as you go through it.
Well, it's quite a visual thing to say, though, isn't it? It's quite, it gets your imagination.
Yeah, I couldn't think of a better place to start than, you know, there they are outside Rome, and civilization is about to collapse, isn't it? And it's just this tribe of exotically dressed.
Because of that, here we are, John, on this stage.
In a sense,
Because
yeah,
of
it's
them.
true, isn't it? Yeah, the Visigoths. Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know if anybody realises this is the perfect spot for the book, as a proto Bauhaus 1919 played here. Well, not actually Bauhaus 1919. But they're a proto version. So Danny, Kevin, and David J. They had various bands before Big Murphy came along.
Yeah, I've got Andrew Cruikshank's book.
Yeah,
it's a really good book.
But basically, they had quite a few sort of. They toyed with punk, Submerged Tenth, and then sort of power pop, which was the craze. And Jack Plug and the Sockets, and I think we're probably just about, they played in this bit here, we're talking about late 70s. I don't think actually Bauhaus ever played here, did they?
No.
No, they never played in this actual pub, but the ghosts of them are here. But so how do they fit in with your defining viewpoint?
Well, I mean,
Goth.
obviously they would never think of themselves as being a goth band, but the audience would see them as being a very definite goth band. I mean, I always think it's up to the audience decides what bands are. I understand why bands don't want to be put into scenes, because you can't get out of the scene once you're in, and people have expectations, which, if you're a true artist, there should be no boundaries at all. But it's a shorthand, isn't it? So if you say to me, there's a really good young band in Northampton right now, and I go, I've got 10 seconds, I've got to get a bus, what they like, you go, kind of post-punk gothy, and I go, that sounds interesting, because you don't have an hour to explain what they like, so it's a shorthand, isn't it?
Also, I run a record shop, so if you did have about a million different sections, slightly differently titled, you never get where.
But it's kind of good to have it as a shorthand, so people know what they're getting. So when we're using the word here in the context of the book or this conversation, we're not putting anybody in prison, so we'll get that bit out of the way. But so I think a lot of people around the world see them as being. There was strands before, of course. I mean, I've talked about that before the Doors, you know, and with Jim Morrison was, you know, because he had the baritone voice, he had the black leather look, he had the fascination of the Romantic poets. They had a very baroque kind of gothic style of music with a darkness to it. There it is. There's the first template. But then we have to go through the 70s, and David Bowie is really important as well. And I think if you make a mathematical formula of what goth is, it's probably Jim Morrison plus David Bowie times punk equals goth. But I know there's 8 million other things going in there as well. That's a gross simplification. But David Bowie is really key to the whole thing, because obviously musically, but also culturally, because all his interviews in the 70s, they'd be like gateways into stuff. You know, he would talk about William Burroughs and the Stooges and the Velvets, which now, I mean, they're all, everyone knows this stuff. It's all mainstream. But then these are portals into another culture. And if you were 13, 14 years old, it was stuff you couldn't even get. You know, trying to get a studios record of Blackpool before punk was almost impossible. But it was this kind of this idea, this exotic other stuff existing out there, and it's part of what, to quote Eddie Bow, was a crash course for the ravers. You know, this is where we were learning about this stuff, and I think that's his really important impact. And also the Berlin records, I think they're really important because they're very minimalistic but very dark records with a very futuristic sound. I think that plays into it as well. I think in a way what Joy Division were doing with Martin Hannett was trying to get a northern, their kind of version of that kind of sound, you know, that very, I mean, to this day Joy Division's records still sound like the future, and I think again they're not a goth band, they never look like a goth band, but their actual sound was a whole new sound and a whole new space to exist in. So Susie's around as well. I'll get to this in a minute. But Susie, they formed as a punk band. They played the punk festival in September '76 at the 100 Club, and they did that jam with Marco on guitar. You know, and it's great. And the first Banshees album is an incredible album. I think it's really influential. Kenny Morris's tribal drums, John McKay's like amazing chiming glass guitar. He never gets enough credit for that. He's the first person I'd ever heard who had that guitar sound, which Keith Levine would take on another sort of trip afterwards. And Keith was an amazing guitar player as well, but John was the first one to have it. That album came out really early. And of course Susie's vocal style and her actual style, whereas Bowie had changed his style every year, Susie changed it every photo session, but every photo session she looked amazing in. And you would get every single club you went to in that period, and for about 5-10 years afterwards, all the women looked like her, but a lot of the men did as well. You know, she was such an important sartorial influence. But where all this sort of pre-bit coalesces for a lot of people historically is with Bela Lugosi's Dead, which is Bauhaus's obviously first single, which I think, if I'm correct, if I've been told the truth in the interviews, they wrote in their first rehearsal, which I think is quite amazing. When most bands are kind of arguing over who's going to be the drummer and the bass player, they come up with a song that's a classic defining, not just a great song, but a genre defining track. And your first song you put out is 8-9 minutes long. It's pretty daring. It's a style of music that I don't think there's any sort of precedence to at all. And it comes out, and I think that's where the whole thing for a lot of people coalesces at that point. So that's where we get to. Yeah.
Okay, we'll rewind a little bit. After punk happened, there's a noticeable shift towards what was termed positive punk. The bands like Play Dead and UKD and House Gang. Who came up with the term Gothic? When did it, and who did it? Was it a sort of a journalist thing or what?
Well, there's a few different things. Obviously, the term Gothic had already been used. I mean, it's been around a long time, but in the context of rock and roll with the Doors, that first review, '67, the next band to be called Gothic was Joy Division. Oh, no, sorry, the Banshees, the next band in a review in 1979. Then Joy Division were called Gothic. Tony Wilson described them as Gothic, and Martin Hannett described them as dance music with Gothic overtones. So
did they know they were Gothic?
Well, Peter Hook to this day,
told.
Hooky to this day likes to think of himself as being sort of a punky goth band, you know. And and Hooky, I think Hooky's probably the closest to that kind of culture anyway. But it's Gothic with the IC on the end, which is different, isn't it? Because that's more about cathedrals than literature, isn't it? The term goth was it's two different routes, isn't it? So Ian Astbury would say it's what he would nickname Sex Gang children, and Andy Sexgang he would call them the Gothic Goblin when he has sort of like a little bit of banter. There's also reviewing sounds where UKDK get described as Gothic as well. But positive punk was Richard North, who's the NME writer, and he didn't write it as a scene. It was more a piece about, because punk to him felt like it got really negative, so he's trying to get reconnect with the positivity he felt from punk, and it's about Blood and Roses and his band Brigandage, and both were really great bands. And it was used as in fact, it's a very good term.
Temporary.
It's temporary because but there's a lot of temporary terms, because also, I don't know, I now start to realise going around doing these talks, it's probably a very northern term, but bands were called raincoat bands, and that was like Joy Division and The Cure, I know The Cure from the south, but Robb was actually from Blackpool originally, so he does count. But because they wore raincoats and the music was slightly dark, they were called raincoat bands, and that was around, but it's mainly called alternative music. And then it became goth. It was a retrospective term for a scene that was already there. So none of these bands ever formed as goth bands, but you would hear them in goth clubs, and that's the definition, I think.
Okay, there's certainly a lot of bands appearing after this time, especially from the north. Sisters, March Violence, New Modern Army, etc. Was the environment more conducive in places like Leeds, Sheffield and Bradford? And does that relate more to the literary history of the area?
I don't think it does actually. I think it's just their ways of reacting to punk, you know, and it's probably key, 2 or 3 key figures in each town driving it. I don't think anybody said, you know, I know Manchester kind of toyed with the factory, you know, because it's a kind of a pun in it, so it's Andy Warhol's factory, obviously, and also the idea that Manchester was full of derelict factories at the time. And it was kind of creating almost a new kind of romanticism, you know, whereas the Romantics have been very anti-industrial revolution and embracing nature. That kind of period, that post-punk period, in the Manchester time, was embracing the factories and probably looking down on nature. I mean, Manchester now is utterly completely different looking city than it was then. And they had a romantic notion of what Manchester was then, which most people didn't, because it was a very broken city. But I don't think Joy Division ever went into their rehearsal room in Little Peter Street and said, let's write a lot of songs reflecting the dereliction of the city around us. I mean, it's when I interview like Hooky, you know, to this day, he has no idea where his beautiful bass lines come from. He's an incredible bass line, super melodic, right, really great. You know, they're very sensitive to bass lines. But I don't know if anybody's ever met Hooky, but Hooky doesn't come over as being that sensitive. But which is very northern, isn't it? You know, that thing where it's all front, really, isn't it? And he just says, "I just play it, it came out," you know. So it wasn't like they were sat there going, "Look at the dereliction all around us. Let's make a poetic song about it."
Maybe they didn't have to. It's obvious. It's there. Because I remember
it's escaping from it.
Loverall Terrace Park video. Is it in a kind of an abandoned warehouse?
That's the rehearsal room. That's Little Peter Street. It's gone now. It's knocked down. It's Manchester. It's been knocked down years ago. But I often walk down there. People come from LA or something, and you go, I'll show just round the corner. That's where that video was, and people go, wow, I thought it was in some, you know, like New York or somewhere, but it's just this little back street in Manchester. But that was their rehearsal room. The one I was talking about, that's where that was made in, and it's one of the last songs they ever wrote, wasn't it? I mean, it took them 10 minutes. Hooky always says it took me 10 minutes to write that, and I lived off it for 40 years.
Right.
I think Ian Curtis probably had more of an idea, conceptual idea of it. I mean, he had the records, definitely. I mean, Hooky would always say that. He said to Ian Curtis once, people say we sound like the Doors, what do they sound like? And Ian Curtis got the record out and played it, and he goes, fuck me, we do sound a bit like the Doors. So it was all accidental, that was the thing. It was almost instinctive, you know, and I think it was an instinctive reaction, like I say initially, reaction to punk, you know, that thing where with punk everyone goes, whoa, let's do something, I have no idea what I'm doing, and then you end up there a year later, and then people forever ask you, that was very conceptual of you. I think maybe because the environment was there, it seeps in without you noticing, but it's never done as a deliberate reaction to environment. Because you've got to remember, Ian Curtis was actually from Macclesfield, which is about half an hour outside Manchester. He went to Maxfield Grammar, and Maxfield's a relatively affluent town at the time. It's a silk town, and it's got what's its weird statistic? Maxfield, it's got the longest running Tory seat in the country, which is very un-northern. You know, it's not a very typically northern place. So he was there, but Ian Curtis was a massive fan of music. You know, you seen that great picture of 1975 with the Nectar T-shirt. It was like this kind of sort of associate krautrock band without being directly one. I mean, not only most people never heard of Nectar, who could ever buy a band T-shirt in 1975? And he's at the Mont de Marsan Festival in France in 1975. He was a hip kid. He knew his stuff, you know.
He was way ahead.
Yeah, whereas the rest of the band knew bits and bobs, but somehow they made pretty brilliant music. Accidentally, you know.
I'll go back to Bowie again. Bowie had a lot of sort of dark glam theatrics, which was obviously, you said earlier, that was an inspiration for many bands. But is it art rock or gothic rock? Is the subject matter, or is it the dress style? So is it the subject, or is the way somebody looks?
Oh, it's everything. I think all the greatest music that comes out of it, and all great culture, it's about the clothes, isn't it? So you've got to have the right pair of socks to go with the right riff. That's what we do here, isn't it? Forever. You know, and it's like Americans and all the bands, this is a gross generalisation, of course, but in America, most bands, it's just, you know, pumps, jeans and t-shirts, isn't it? But here, you know, we invent all these youth cultures endlessly, you know, and then we discard them really quickly. The rest of the world embraces them forever, doesn't it, you know? And they come out of towns like this, that's what's amazing, you know. it's amazing a band that's so complex and nuanced as Bauhaus came from a small town in England, you know, and it breaks the narrative, you know, the narrative of the time was everything happens in London, you know, but it doesn't. It happens in places like this. All the cool shit comes out of places where people have all that time and nobody interfering to come up with something that's really unique without even realising it, which I really love as well. So going back to Bowie, yeah, what he looked like was as important as what he sounded like, you know. The way his hair was, you know, and his makeup and all that was really revolutionary at the time. It was unobtainable as well. And I remember as a kid growing up in Blackpool, you know, Bowie looked like, you know, he looked like he came from outer space or London. And if you're a young kid in Blackpool, that's the same thing. I mean, London was outer space for us, you know. But Bowie would give you hope, you know, that there was something more than the mundane life that was mapped out in front of you that you didn't really want to have, you know. But you had no idea how to get into that world, but you knew there's another world there, which kind of gave you hope. And I think that was what important about it. And the artfulness, you know, and it brought an artfulness to pop culture, because I think a lot of the greatest British music is very artful and art rock. And that's what goth was as well, glam rock as well. And I was a glam rock kid. I mean, I didn't dress in glam rock. I mean, when you were 12 in Blackpool, you couldn't buy that kind of stuff. You could probably buy a clown outfit, but you couldn't dress up in like glam clothes. It didn't exist, and it was hard enough walking around in Blackpool anyway. I didn't be.
I think Bowie had the same problem, didn't he? Ashes to Ashes.
I mean, he looked good in Ashes to Ashes. One of his last great moments. You know, that song and that video are great, aren't they? I know, and that song again and that video has a mystery to it. I think mystery, and you mentioned theatrics before, but theatricality is really important. You know, the theatricality of Bowie was really important. It was like a rock band that wasn't a rock band. It was ironic, wasn't it, in a sense. It wasn't like rock bands before. There'd been great bands in the 60s, but they had to really mean it, and you couldn't tell if Bowie meant it or not. But by being slightly disassociated and artful and theatrical, it was actually even more emotional in a sense, and there's a massive emotional clout to Bowie's music without actually playing that card. And also the fluid sexuality thing. I mean, I remember that interview, the Dennis Baker interview, and I remember when it came out and stuff literally came out, and I don't think anybody at my school knew what he meant, you know, it was because we were so naive, you know, we were only about 12, and we go, what is bisexual, you know, I mean, most of us didn't even know what being heterosexual was, because the girls would go near you when you were a 12-year-old boy, would they, you know, so, but you could tell it was something that was esoteric and something that was a bit more of the beyond, which you always wanted from your pop stars of that generation. And Top of the Pops was the portal, wasn't it? I mean, I guess everybody of a certain age would, every week, Top of the Pops was a bit where outer space landed in your living room, wasn't it? And then Bowie was the main one, and culturally, but I mean, Mark Bolan was equal musically, you know. And to this day, I'll probably listen to Bolan more, because I think Bolan had a musical genius, and every single song he wrote, even though it feels very simple, is actually a complete work of genius, you know. It's his singing, his voice. But even the Division 2 and Division 3 glam, going all the way down to like Mud, the singles great, Jimmy Chapman, that songwriting machine was ace, and that was my whole thing, Top of the Pops, and that was a dream, and it was a world you could never get into, and then somehow I bumbled into it, but only on the side of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're heading off somewhere else there. No.
Well, no, glam rock is the bedding, glam rock was the foundation, you know. Goth itself was actually, you could say it was the second act of glam. It was glam part 2, it was dark glam, you know. In a way, you could argue that someone like Adam Ant was he's very much part punk, and a very important precursor to goth as well.
Well, he would have been watching. He would have been watching Top of the Pops with the glam bands.
But he could actually be the last of the glam rock stars in a sense. Yeah.
Okay, right. A lot of bands deny being goth, but have a strong goth following. Why are they in denial? I just sort of said that before, but I think a lot of their bands don't. If you're a true artist, you don't want to be trapped into a scene, you know. I mean, that's one reason. Also because it's a retrospective term for a scene that's already there, you know. And also for bands that are already formed. I mean, none of these bands formed to be a goth band. The later ones would have done, but the initial bands were inspired by punk or glam, and were making their own versions of that kind of music. And then to suddenly find themselves all cobbled together into a scene of bands they never even met or any idea about. You can understand why they don't like that. And also I think it's kind of playful as well, that kind of sneery
cynicism about the term is very British, isn't it? You know, it's the same thing in punk. I mean, a lot of bands in punk will say they're not punk, or then they'll say we're not punk, and then they'll tell you why every other band in the punk scene is not punk, and they actually are. So it's that confusion is brilliant, isn't it? That thing where it's not textbook, is it? And that's if you're an academic, you would say, well, they are, and describe why they are. But I like to leave it open. Obviously, my book's got the word goth in the title, but I don't care if the bands don't want to be goth or not. I'm quite happy for them to be themselves in it. But the thing was, and like I said before, the audience really defines it. So what the book was doing, in a sense, was, you know, after the fall of Rome, I do a big piece on a typical goth club in 79, 80, 81, you know, when it was called the Returns Club, what it was like in there. And all the chapters and all the key bands out the scene were actually the playlist of that club, you know. So what you would always hear in those clubs, I wrote about the histories of each of those bands and the completely different directions they were kind of coming in to actually end up in the same place, which is in that goth club. So whether that be the Cramps, whether that be Bauhaus or Sister Mercy, all kind of goth club classics of bands who weren't goth bands. I mean, the Cramps, you'd hear them 5 times a night at a goth club, but they were never formed as goth band. They're formed as a psychedelic band who's took their influence from backward roots rockabilly, you know, and but with lots of acid chucked on top, which makes them a complete. When you unpack the Cramps, that's a really fascinating story.
Well, you've certainly been part of some kind of zeitgeist, because I've noticed there's some other books about goth come out. Is it Lol Tollos from The Cure? Is there one recently as well?
No, he comes out in September.
Okay,
yeah.
So I know there's a few others. And also there's that Batcave compilation, and I think it's a book as well with it. So is it time to reevaluate and give the movement its dues?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do with the book. I'm trying to say it was a serious culture, you know, and it was also fun, you know, people had good times at the clubs. I mean, I think there's that great expression in it's a he because it's an old expression, so it's not a they, it should be they, shouldn't it? He who fears death cannot embrace life, and I think that's kind of part of the core of this, you know, the heavy themes what this band's singing about, but also a very tongue-in-cheek kind of way as well. And going to those clubs in that period of time was really good fun, and it's quite decadent, you know, people were doing a lot of drugs and a lot of crazy stuff as well, which was great as well, you know, and it's that's all part of it, but it wasn't like backing away from the dark stuff or the heavy stuff at the same time. And that melancholy, that embrace of melancholy, often makes the greatest music that comes out of this country. You know, we live in a country where it rains all the time, it's got a grey sky, we don't have any choice, it's always going to be melancholic. Although, interestingly enough, the goth scenes now are big and warm countries, aren't they? So, if you go to California,
Brazil.
It's enormous, or Brazil or Japan or the Mediterranean, that's the place where the scene really, really thrives, you know.
Okay, right. Before I chuck it out to the audience via Graham, I've got a couple of questions sent by Kevin Haskins from Bauhaus and Love and Rockets. You might have covered this before, but I'll read about it anyway. Aside from musical influence, I think it's safe to say that bands are also a product of their environment. Susie is from Bromley, The Cure from Crawley, and Bauhaus from Northampton. What kind of comparisons can you draw from this?
I think I did allude to that before, you know, is a lot of the culture that came out of small towns. It wasn't, I know the Batcave's in Soho, but it's only, to me the Batcave is an important club, but it's not the driver of the whole culture. It was happening anyway, you know, it's already happening in other places, and everybody's coming up with the same conclusions. It's like convergent evolution, isn't it? It's like the marsupials in Australia and the mammals somewhere else, and they're all got different versions of the same thing. So when Bauhaus are coming together, sisters are coming together in Leeds, and it's not like they're writing each other letters, they don't know each other exist, you know. And so I think that's what, I think one of the reasons the music press didn't really jump on goth was because it didn't come out of London. It wasn't in their 4 or 5 pubs where the music press runs around. It actually came out of places on the outside. It was an outsider culture, so naturally it's remained an outsider culture. It's appealed to people outsiders because that was where it came from in the first place. And I really like the idea of people in small towns, because I come from a small town or a smallish town, you know, that thing that we weren't, you know, we might be naive, but we weren't culturally backwards, you know. We can make our own culture up. We didn't need to go to London to get these, you know, the tablets from the top of the hill. Oh, that's how you do it. I never realised, you know. It wasn't like that. It was just, the culture was as valid anywhere, you know. And I think in a sense, pop culture has been becoming more and more like that as time's gone along now. Because we need more spread because of the internet. It doesn't really matter where you are. You're plugged into the whole zeitgeist all the time. But at that time, it was more difficult, but it was still happening, you know. So those bands, I mean, they were suburban and they're coming from small towns, and the goth thing. Very rarely was any of the key goth bands came from London. Probably the most important was Specimen, who came from Bristol anyway, moved to London to the Back Cave. There was Alien Sex Fiends who hung around the Back Cave. And there was Sex Gang Children, who would have been one of the biggest goth bands if they hadn't imploded so early, you know. But when you think about all the other bands, you know, like System of a or Southern Deathcore, who formed in Bradford, you know, I mean, Bradford is like, you know, that's a city where nothing came out before. Was it Kiki D and Smokey who come out of there? You know, and that was their pop cultural markers. And this incredibly exotic band appears out of Bradford, you know, and a lot of that's because New Model Army have created a space, and I think all great culture comes out of space. Like we're in now. This is what, like you said, the bands that played years ago, gone to do other stuff. You need the space to make that happen. Whether it's your record shop or somebody's clothes shop or the pub club, like Graham was talking about before in Harpole, whatever it was, and that. You know, where's a space to make things happen? Things happen, and I think New Model Army had this terrace house and. In Bradford, and Justin Sullivan had gone to Bradford University. He's one of the few people who'd gone to Bradford University and stayed in Bradford and hadn't, you know, moved away after. Students usually tend to stay. If it's a cool city, they stay there. But he made something out of it. And in a way, now when you think of New Model Army, you can't forget anything more stubborn Yorkshire and Bradford as New Model Army, and yet he's from somewhere near Harlow, you know, which is quite interesting. But in that house, and it was Jules as well, who really was the driving force in this, and she came from down south actually. And they had this cellar in the house with band rehearsed, and Violation, who was the band before Southern Deathcore, rehearsed in that cellar. And Ian Asprey was following Crass around on tour, needed someone to stay, and he ended up in that sort of hang around Bradford. They spotted him dancing in a club. And this is so brilliant, typical of that time. They thought, he's a cool looking kid who's a good dancer, he must be a singer, let's get him in our band. And which I think is a perfect kind of audition, isn't it, in a sense. They'd never heard him sing. He just happened to be a really good singer as well. I don't think he'd ever sung in his life. And that became Southern Deathcore, and they came out of Bradford, and they would have been the biggest band on the scene, but again, they imploded too soon, and he went on to, obviously, Cult became incredibly successful. But I think it's one of those great wives. What if they'd actually made the album? So the album's, you know, like demos and singles and sessions and bits and bobs. It's a great record. But what if they'd actually had the chance to make that record properly? It would have been a really defining kind of record, you know, really important record. So a lot of those bands did come out of places where I think the thing was that people didn't feel like they had to. If you came from a small town then, you would probably never go to London. You think, well, the music business is not going to sign us up. No major label is going to sign us up. We'll put it out ourselves. We'll do it in our own way. We'll do it completely DIY. We'll make our own culture. We'll make it as exaggerated as possible. We don't give a fuck about the music business, and that always makes the best music and culture. I'm sure that was probably Bauhaus thinking as well. And
well, this is kind of leads to his second question.
Out of all the other youth cultures, goth is probably the most pervasive. In fact, Gothic literature predates it by a century or two. How do you explain its allure and longevity?
I think every generation has to deal with its blues in whatever technology to hand at that time. So, with the romantic literature, that was writing poetry and writing books, or if you were a painter at the time, you do painting. So, because rock and roll was the predominant culture of my generation in the late 70s and the early 80s, that's how you'd express it. I mean, yeah, people would do other kind of art forms, but that was the predominant art form, the most accessible art form. And so to people to do that, embracing melancholia, or dealing with its blues, or that generation, music was obviously the place you would go to. You know, whether you could play or not didn't matter. It was just space. It was a space to do something creative to deal with that kind of feeling. Now, as time's gone on, it's sort of in lots of other cultures. You know, because music is not the main culture now. It's a soundtrack to other cultures, and it's still huge, and it's still great new bands and that. But it's not the only culture. So there's goth gaming now, or goth social influencers. So you get pictures of people standing in a forest putting pictures in the middle of Russia, putting pictures up on Instagram, but no music on it. You know, it's what they look like. You know, actually, stylistically, is more important than the music for a lot of people. Some people combine them, but that's so that's the way. That's how this generation would do it, and the next generation will probably have a completely different way to do it as well. The feeling never goes away. It's just the way the avatar to actually get the feeling out there just changes, doesn't it? So whether it's sacking road, or whether it's getting a band together, or whether it's an Instagram account, it's all dealt with in the book. Yeah.
Sorry. Right, Graham Bentley, who's the original Bauhaus manager. Do you want to ask away or comment?
Yep.
Don't say no.
I checked you out on YouTube, and I found a 3-minute one that was 8 years ago, and you were promoting this book. So did it really take you 8 years?
No, it took longer. It's about 10 years.
10 years, right?
Yeah. It's just because it's a really big book and there's a lot of work has to go into it. Then it stopped start because it's not the thing I do all the time. And then I went through 3 different publishers because my vision didn't match their vision. And then there was an editor working on it. It just kept disappearing. So God, it was every single problem you can have in making a book. And then I finally got the sodding thing out in this year. So it should have come out about 3 years ago. But it's 270,000 words, and that takes a lot. And also, because it's a lot of, it's quite factual based, a lot of it. So it's a lot of like 16th century obscure writers in there. And you have to check out what the names are spelled like. And annoyingly, there is about 15 mistakes there, which drives me mad because I hate mistakes. You know, after all that, so it's, I'm working lots of different editors. And also the weird thing when you do a book and you get an editor in, editors don't always know how to spell people's names. So people have a name that's got an unusual spelling, they spell it correctly, even though it's meant to be. I've had this once in a book where I put the Beatles in it, and the editor, and I didn't notice it's spelled with 2 E's. Because they thought that's the correct way of spelling it, which it is technically, isn't it, but not in pop culture. Yeah. So that's why it took a really, really long time. But I'm glad I put it on my own. In the end, I bought it off the last publisher, Omnibus, because they wanted me to take it. They said you shouldn't put the romantic poets in there. Just do the bands. I go, well, that's been done, and you have to put the big story in there. It has the whole story and tie it all together. And when you read it, it's like a journey, and it's like a full-on trip that exposes all the generations dealing with the blues, and then, like I said about a minute ago, and it has to be, all of that has to be in there. Because the thing about Gothic culture is, like punk was like a lot of teenagers taking speed, instant culture like that, no depth to it, just bang, go and do it, which is brilliant. But as somebody said when I was writing the book, goths read books, and it was a culture that was very informed and very versed and had a very deep understanding of its own roots. And I think uniquely almost to any kind of sort of pop culture we kind of create in this country, it does go back centuries, and it is something that has lots of precedents that go back in different times. And I thought, if I don't deal with that, I'm just writing a very shallow book. It's good to put those lines in, and it's good to be pretentious. I think all the greatest pop culture is completely pretentious, isn't it? Because, it is pretentious to say Lord Byron was a rock star, but he was. And it is pretentious to say Jim Morrison was not modern now, but kind of modern version of Lord Byron. Why not? They're kind of mad poets of their time, or Peter Murphy, or all those kind of people. Those people that kind of step out into the beyond should be celebrated. They could all be incredibly difficult people, but that's the beauty of it, isn't it? And I wanted to celebrate all that in the book. That was important.
Excellent.
You got anything more, Graham, or is that?
Yeah.
Hold on a minute.
I was actually given your book for my birthday, so I had time to read it, and I particularly like I don't know what the word is, but the bits down the bottom.
Oh, the footnotes.
Yeah, the footnotes. Yeah.
I love footnotes.
Yeah.
Because I think because we're all online all the time, to me footnotes have changed their role. I think in old books, they were just, in academic books, you sort of say, if you quote somebody, put it in the footnote at the bottom. But I think now with the internet, because you go through links and you kind of read one thing, go down the rabbit hole and come back. To me, in print media, the footnote is the equivalent of a link on a website. So, because I don't really read anything now apart from on my phone. I read books on my phone, do everything on my phone and that. So I think in a way, like, we're almost become cyborgs. You know, we are an AI. That man, and it won't end well. It's going to be Terminator's the only accurate film about the future. It's going to be an eternal war between the robots. But the 100 years before that might be okay, you know. So now when I think in my head, I actually start to think. I start to think like a website, you know. And you think. So the footnote is the link, and then you come back and you go back into the analysis again. So I play around with the footnotes. So some of them are saying where the quotation's from, and some of them are tangents, you know. So I love conversations with mad tangents as well. So you veer off, and the footnotes where you veer off, then you go back into the book again as well. So you can read it. It's like with 3D chess in Star Trek. I like to think of the page like that. So you've got the narrative, and you've got the bits where you're zigzagging it out, and back onto the narrative again.
I think how many footnotes have you done? Is it
in
a
that
couple
book,
of thousand?
I think there's about 2,000.
Yeah, I thought so, yeah.
The original index was amazing. When the publisher sent the index is 100 pages long. So I had to go through it, trying to shrink it down. Now it's about 25 pages. I think you're actually in the index. I'm going to have to look that up, because when I met you before, because I never met you before, I was thinking, oh God, I think he's actually in the index of the book.
Okay, anybody else in the audience want to ask something? Okay, right at the back there.
Yeah. So we talked, fascinating hearing what you're talking about. And I've got your book, going to get signed afterwards, and I haven't read it yet. Brilliant to look at retrospective, the sort of, the way that punk changed into proto-punk and goth, etc. For you, Rob, John, what is your vision about goth now? What is the future, particularly with music at the heart of this now? I listen to loads of music. I don't label anything. I don't really have any generic preferences. But I'd be really interested to know where you think goth culture lives now, where it's moving towards, and if there are any references from bands or areas or even geographical areas where you think it's with this amorphous mess that we have with making music now. Where do you hit your label now, mate?
Well, I think it's a very core community, so Whitby Goth Festival, which is on 2 or 3 times a year, you can only keep up with it because you keep changing the promoter of it every time as well. Every time I go there and play there, it's a completely different promoter. But that's the core of the scene, of a lot of the people there, with a lot of the originals on the scene in the first place. And I think I talked about it with somebody before, and I can't see because I've got terrible eyesight, but the idea that Whitby's actually become a goth town, so older goths now, a lot of them got very good jobs, moved to Whitby and buy a house there. So within 50 years, the whole town's just going to be goths. It's going to be like this goth enclave on the seaside, the perfect place in it, on every single way, historically, and what it looks like and things. So you've got that. And in Europe, you've got this huge kind of goth festivals with 20,000 people go to, so that's really big. And then you've got these original kind of pillars of goth. I mean, we'll never say they were goth again, we have to put that little caveat in, footnote. Like people like Nick Cave or The Cure, now play like arenas and stadiums, they're enormous. When you used to go see those people play in the early 80s, or like The Cure in the late 70s, you've got 300 people at the gig. You would never go and see Nick Cave like the Bird Party or the early days of doing solo stuff, I think, one day this guy's going to be playing to 20,000 people. It just would never compute at all. So a lot of those people got embraced right up into the mainstream of culture, which is quite amazing, really. We think musically, like you go and see The Cure now, and he's got the pop hits, but it's still pretty heavy bound, and it's got a very dark atmosphere to it. And he can headline Glastonbury, and it just seems, done it twice, it just seems a completely natural fit for it now. So in a way, it's become a very mainstream culture, but with an underground at the same time. And then all its bits of DNA have kind of gone all over the place, haven't they? So I was saying before about, get those Instagram influencers, and there's loads of them that I see on Instagram, we follow each other and that. People in the middle of Russia, standing in a forest you'll never be able to go to now because you can't get to Russia anymore because of their lunatic president. But they stand in the forest and have a picture taken looking very gothic, but the music doesn't attach to it at all. And it's just because of the style of it, that's in there, the gothic games in there, gothic films, of course Tim Burton, which is probably the #1 ambassador for goth because he was a teenage goth, so everything he does has a gothic tinge to it, like his Batman films, or famously recently with Wednesday, which has ended up giving the Cramps this kind of weird second wind, because all these kind of kids in America now do the Cramps dance and go to Spotify to listen to it, and the Cramps Spotify number's gone through the roof, so they've earned 20 quid off that, you know, so it's the big money's pouring in, you know, and got Gothic literature, you know, and you know, get writers like Ian Rankin, who does his Rebus books, and Ian's really into post-punk and goth, so it's a lot of dark music, and it's all the way through the books. Sometimes he actually references the records or references the atmosphere that's in there. And lots of other films and lots of other TV series. And I mean, I don't really watch the telly, but I was right at my mum's about a month ago. There's some really crap programme on that your mum will watch, but it's fine, it's nice watching the telly with your mum, isn't it? And the Joy Division demo was part of the soundtrack of it. It wasn't even what a famous track. I was going, whoa, am I the only person that can know what this is? And I just thought, and it's the way that these little bits of things seep into the mainstream culture. And so everywhere you go, it's like punk, innit? It's like unless you go to a festival or a gig, you'll never see a punk. You very rarely see anybody walk down the street looks goth. But everywhere you go, you see it in the culture, don't you? So in pop terms, you get something like Billie Eilish, and her first album has a gothic DNA in it. You know, it's minimalistic. It's got a dark, shadowy edge to it. It's also pop music, and she likes that kind of music. And also people like Grimes. You know, Grimes is really into industrial music, and that's another whole thing which you did write about in the book. You know, the interesting journey of industrial, from Throbbing Gristle all the way through to Nine Inch Nails. It's almost a completely, utterly different culture, but there's actually a line that joins together, and it intermingles and with goth all the time. So in a way, it's kind of everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. I mean, you know, it's and all the old bands are slowly becoming classic bands, and brilliantly, all the young goths call them trad goth bands, which I think is such great terms. That's a t-shirt, isn't it? Trad goth. If there's a goth covers band, that's what they should call themselves, isn't it? And then there's young bands operating in kind of goth as well. You know, so there's new bands doing it, bands like Soft Moon do a very good industrial kind of Cure thing. I was playing before on the Spotify list. There's a really great young singer coming out of London called Freya Beer, who does a PJ Harvey-esque thing, you know, very sparse, very, you know, very poetic, but fucking brilliant, really good. You know, so the culture's going on that style, but also electronic music with EBM. So if you go to European goth clubs, that's what they play nearly all night. It's just kind of very dark sort of goth techno EBM kind of music, with a little trad goth section sort of towards the end somewhere, you know. And stylistically as well, so every 2 years, the catwalk, when they run out of ideas, they just nick everyone. They always nick ideas off the street. They do their goth fashion, don't they? You know, it's like, that's not yours. That's what people wear anyway. You didn't start that. So that's how it kind of goes on, round and round, and it's in culture all the time. So, like I say, it's everywhere and nowhere all at once, isn't it?
Anybody else got a question?
I think mine almost blends into that a bit, but I'm from New Whitby, but I'm not a goth. But it was a bit about, I was very interested about your cultural marcation, about how everyone defines themselves from where they're from or where they are. And I was wondering what you thought about that with genre of music, where people are almost, where it stops us loving the things, the music that we like, or being the music that we like, because we're almost afraid to say, oh, I'm into glam rock, I'm soft rock, I'm a goth. And we all need to define ourselves either by where we're from or what we think we should be, rather than just liking what we hear or feel.
Well, I think because we're tribal, aren't we? So I think people are always looking for a tribe, aren't they? So we're naturally tribal, aren't we? I mean, you just have to look at chimpanzees to work out, you know, our closest ancestor, to work out how tribal we are. That's a survival mechanism, isn't it? So you know, people from Northampton, you know, you'd argue about each bit of town. I'm in the best bit of town, you're the soft bit of town, whatever. But then somebody comes here from, I don't know, Luton. It's like, we're all Northampton, fuck Luton. And then people in the gossip all of arguments over which bit's this and which bit's that, you know. And then when somebody comes from the outside, we're all together. And that's a natural human thing. I think, yeah, you get purists who completely define themselves by the scene and the very narrow parameters of it. But most people I would know from that kind of period like the culture, like the music and like the clothes. But they have pretty broad music taste. I do expand it out in the book. There's other things. When we went to Goth Club, it wasn't just the classics you would hear in there. You would hear stuff like Grace Jones in there. You would hear The Fall in there. You'd hear like sort of stuff that was alternative. You know, some of the clubs were probably feeling more alternative post-punk. with bits of goth in them. It wasn't always just exactly what you'd expect to hear in there at the same time. So, and also as soon as something becomes codified, people try and break the code, don't they? And also it subdivides as well, doesn't it? It's a bit like the universe and the Big Bang and creating all these other galaxies. You start with one thing and there were about 10,000 of them. So there's all these subgenres of goth as well at the same time. So you get, you know, the more electronic end of it, the more the trad goth end of it, you know. There even like sort of, like, you know, I mean, Gun Club and Cramps is in goth but out of goth at the same time. That's another version of it. So it's so I think people do define themselves tribally, but they don't often stay within the tribe, do they? It's complex, isn't it? People hold a lot of different ideas at the same time. But I think the thing about maybe what was the important thing about those kind of golf clubs, and the clubs themselves were really important drivers of the culture. I think there were safe spaces. There were spaces you could go to, and you weren't going to get beaten up for wearing something slightly freaky. So in small towns, there would be goths there, but there'd be punks there, psychobillies. Everybody would kind of go there within this space where it was kind of safe to be alternative. So in a way, I think it's a shame. I mean, I actually quite like the term goth because it's quite a cool term. It's got like a history to it. But really, I think the best name for it, well, positive punk would have been good, but alternative is actually what it was. It was alternative culture. But even that would make no sense now because you can't be alternative and be the Cure. I mean, what's the Cure? Well, the Cure are mainstream, aren't they? In a glorious way, completely on their own terms, still making great music, and their next album is quite exciting thinking about it. But is that alternative anymore? It's going to be a worldwide #1 album, isn't it? You know, so it's blurred. It's got more and more blurred as it's kind of gone on, which another thing makes it very difficult to write in a book, isn't it? Because you try to unpack the cliche, but also describe the cliche, and also explain that the cliche doesn't really exist at the same time. So, but I think in a way, in pop culture, because it's not real life in a sense, all it is for me, it doesn't have to be accurate, does it? It doesn't have to be factual or scientific. It can be really blurred and contradictory, which doesn't really answer your question at all, does it?
Is that it from everybody? Yeah? Oh, okay. One more. Go on.
No, I'm thinking of punk, I'm thinking of industrial, I'm thinking of goth, but an intermingled connectivity between all of it as moving forward in a future where everyone could like have their bit as well as a connected. Do you see a future in bands doing that? Because people do.
Of those styles of music?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they actually are, you know, I mean, the only bit of the future I know about is the one that's going on right now. So, and luckily because I do a website, I get sent lots of music, and so I know there's good stuff that works within that kind of field. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot of tragedies about the Russian-Ukraine situation. Obviously, you know, a war.
Politics has a view on
even
this country now.
Oh, well,
and how people feel.
Well, I'll just do the Russia. But in Russia, I was there just before the war, and there's an amazing music scene there. There's loads of like very dark sort of electronic music made by one person on a laptop, which is like very much fits into the industrial thing. There's an amazing band there called Short Paris, really worth checking out. The guy's got a really high voice, tribal drums, and it's quite. If you played that in a goth club in the 80s, people would have loved it, you know. I was trying to hook them up with Depeche Mode. I thought that would be a perfect tour, you know, for them to go play with them, you know. They're still touring Russia, and they're very political, and they only get away with it because they're poetic. I think the KGB is so stupid, they have no idea what the lyrics are about. So they do the gigs, and everyone in the audience is kind of going, You can't say anything, you get 15 years in jail. So they're kind of playing, and you will definitely know that the KGB will go to their gigs. They're up to something, and so far they haven't tricked up, you know. But they're definitely worth checking out. You can find their videos on YouTube. Their videos are very political, quite startling actually. I have no idea how they've not been chucked in jail yet, you know, to stay in that country. So that's examples of that culture going on in America. The UK, you know, it's like Freya being based in London, and loads of other bands, people still make industrial music, electronic music. There's a great young band in Manchester now called Night Bus, who sound a bit like Young Marble Giants and Joy Division, sort of mixed together, you know, but their own version, you know. It's not like they're trying to recreate the glorious past. This is the now, and this is their version of it. So the music's all there. So I guess what you said, because people aren't as tribal now, is that what you're sort of trying to say or something?
No, I believe that people have their tribe, but at the same time, we're tribes that need to intermingle too.
Yeah, but yeah, they always did, didn't they? The way, you know, I think all alternative people, apart from the skinheads, had some sort of communal understanding that they sort of all looked after. I mean, small towns like that, wasn't it? I mean, when I was going to Blackpool, there was only one pub you could go to, and everybody went to that pub. So the hippies, the punks. It's like a lyric of a song, isn't it? And we all went to the same pub, and we all knew each other, and we were all into sort of. I mean, we were always slightly into each other's scenes anyway, weren't we? It wasn't really a massive dividing line that you only like your thing. I mean, we all like bits of all of it. It was all alternative stuff, wasn't it, in a way? And that goes on now. I know a lot of older people think nowadays nobody's that tribal, but they are in a sense. You know, it's probably more subdivided into more smaller tribes, but what your hair looks like and what shoes you got on are as important now to the 15-year-old as they were when we were 15. Because I always think, you know, if somebody was my age then, like 61 or whatever, and, you know, at that time in 1980, they would have no idea. They went in that pub, they go, these all look the same to me, a bit weird. They'd have no idea, no, they're the psychobillies, they're completely different from the goths, you know. You'd have to be in that scene to know the very subtle codes that made each thing slightly different and that. So the creativity, the sartorial and musical creativity is still there, it's still ongoing, and it never goes away. Because I'm not saying you're saying this, but I always think it's funny, people I know always say to me outside music, they always go, it was only great when I was younger. I go, do you really think in all of human culture, fucking thousands of years of it, the only time that people actually made great culture is when you were personally 16? It's just actually insane to think that, isn't it?
Okay, right. You want some signs and books?
Yeah, if you want to buy a book, I'll be over there signing.
Thank you, John Robb.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah. Music.
Got immersed into that. So I would like you to, if you could sign off and say something like, dear Lisa, happy birthday. I can't remember, what's the song from Lucretia might be like? Is it Dance the Ghost?
That's a lot of work. That's fascinating. Where are you from? Are you from here? Yeah, I was just. Oh, dear. You're from here? I'm almost here. What's your name? Paul. Yep. Did I make it? I've been everywhere. Gloucester Guildhall. Yeah, the brand venues on there for when I was there in Gloucester. Yeah, you get more chocolate.
The CD and the
You got all that, okay. I forgot to press the pause. Eh? Sorry, I forgot to press the pause, so what we've got is... easy to interview. He did a thing with Chris Patton. It's on YouTube. The two of them were just standing on stage, and so he's asking questions, but with Chris Patton it's easy because he just flows, you know.
I think for TV, you've got to have
Yeah.
It's always amazing when things get really old. That's what you mean, yeah. 40 years old. Seems like yesterday. I love footnotes. I'm obsessed with footnotes. I even had somebody who had footnotes on footnotes.
Really too bad.
I'm not counting them. Because they're all numbered, aren't they?
Right, exactly.
You actually found my glasses on them, so I think, what's it there about?
You see a lot more. Yeah, that's right.
This guy puts on being for events.
one of the kitchen photography with the coffee.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So we sort of met before.
Yeah, I photographed you.
Indian.
Another probably second or third year in a row now. I did a brother. 21st anniversary.
It's cold, yeah. I'm not just moaning, I'm actually cold. Definitely, yeah. Did you like French nights and when you warm up in the school days?
Of course,
You never met your coach, not always.
no, that's it. You get about 2 weeks. Paying cash because you've just come out blurry. I hate doing with my credit card, and everyone costs of living is really getting to.
You know what I said about them bands to check out? Not near it.
Yeah, I'll get it off.
That's done right.
We took we recorded it, so I'll find out.
That's it.
Yeah, we can
Sure, they're in the book.
You're dipping it out.
I'm still
Yeah,
reading.
because it covers a lot of different stuff.
Graham. Hello, mate.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, all right. Pardon? No, that's all right. I can do two things at once.
I've not heard it. I saw a picture in the paper and I let it come on.
Yeah. I saw that the other day.
I make my own clothes, I'm not going to spend money at that time. All the fashion things.
Is he still doing it?
Yeah.
Oh,
Creative area course in Liverpool. She's very
When it was underneath the
Yeah, my name's Jane, just Jane. Jane. I've seen
You got your card?
and I see lots of articles said about Jordan.
Oh yeah, no, she was very she's a
Tim
star.
Yeah, but I ended up, well, I decided to do things together because I had to switch it stories.
Great. Jordan is the best thing in the school. Nice guy, man. Yeah. Oh yeah, I went to college with him. Oh yeah.
Thank you very much. Can't see about my laughing.
No, I can't either.
Oh, my contacts.
I can't. I have to